Now in the state of Illinois to allow community colleges to offer four-year degrees. Governor Pritzker endorsed this bill in his State of the State address on Wednesday. 24 other states across the country have already implemented this, including Missouri and Indiana. The goal is to help working Illinois residents or residents in rural areas to have easier access of earning a degree. We asked John Wood President Brian Renfro if that's something that would be considered locally.
Right now, John Wood Community College does not have any plans to offer baccalaureate degrees. Should the legislation be approved that would allow baccalaureate degrees to be offered by community colleges. However, we are in support of the statewide initiative to do that.
And while community college across the state would have the ability to offer a bachelor's degree, Illinois residents in the tri-states may still have to travel to those locations to earn that degree. Well, the temps were